Now, today marks Women's Day, a day to reflect on some progress that has been made over the years to achieve the objectives set out to ensure the protection and safeguarding of women's rights and well-being. South Africa's National Development Strategy on Women, which includes various legislative and policy frameworks under the National Development Plan of 2030, lists key focus on economic empowerment and inclusion through structural reforms amid access to resources for women. Additionally, the National Strategic Plan on GBV and Femicide addresses the critical issue of violence against women, while initiatives such as gender budgeting aim to ensure that policies and legislation effectively achieve gender equality outcomes. But how far have we really come? Executive Director at Dlakavu Impact Strategies and researcher at the Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg, Dr. Simamkele Dlakavu weighs in. Doc, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this morning. Maybe let's just speak about some of the research that you have encountered with regards to the progress that has been made in advancing women's rights in South Africa. What are some of the milestones that stand out for you?
Good morning. Good morning to your viewers. Thank you for having me today. To answer your first question about progress that has been made, particularly in feminist research. So when we speak about the democratic era in South Africa, we cannot ignore the multiple-fold progress that has been made in relation to women's rights, as well as the rights of young people, rights of people living with disabilities, as well as the queer community. It is well acknowledged that South Africa has one of the most progressive constitutions in the world that guarantee gender equality. We have a Bill of Rights that guarantees and promotes socioeconomic rights, as well as a few other key laws and policies in place, such as the recently mentioned National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. However, I just want us to go back to how we came to achieve those rights, how we came to be a country that has a constitution that has been seen in some sectors of society as feminist and progressive. So in the wake of the democratic era in South Africa, in the lead up to the CODESA negotiations, as well as approaching the 1994 elections, women of all races in South Africa marched and organized themselves, whether it is in church groups, in political movements, in taxi ranks, in farm spaces. Women organized to say, we will not be excluded in this crafting of a new society. They were heeding warnings from what they had seen happening across the continent as African states gained independence from racial and colonial oppression. However, what we saw in the early 60s and 70s and 80s happening in the continent was that women's rights were seen as an extra and not integral to these new democracies in these African states. So women in South Africa, partly women who were in the liberation movement, took this warning and said, it will not happen in the new South Africa. So they organized themselves and formed the Women's National Coalition. And in matters of weeks, they took themselves and organized themselves across the country to create a set of demands for the kinds of society that they sought to be built. So the reason we have, for instance, right now, the access to progressive policies that guarantee the access to sexual reproductive rights, such as abortions, the reason in which we have women empowerment integral to corporate South Africa and other state institutions. The reason we have, for instance, the rights of domestic workers guaranteed and the challenge to land redistribution mechanism that exclude women is because women dared and chose to organize. Even today, the reason we have the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence is because the total shutdown movement. Even in the continent, South African women were integral to the landmark policy called the Maputo Protocol by the African Union, which commits states to advancing women's rights, including access to political participation, safe abortions, as well as economic empowerment. So these are gains that have to be applauded, that have been made since the democratic era. However, there are still much crises that impact women in this country that we need to take cognizant of, as well as we need to ensure some of the progress that has been made doesn't get eroded.
And I mean, just on that, Dr. Dlakavu, I mean, you speak of how the women of yesteryear really came together in ensuring that their voices are heard and putting together some of those strategies in ensuring that we have all of the progress that we've made so far. Do you find that young women of today carry that same spirit in ensuring that the current issues that are faced by young women are then championed even further?
I work with plenty of young women as an academic, often teaching and organizing with young women. However, to answer your question, I believe that we are not as organized as the women of our yesteryears, as the activists of our yesteryears, because under apartheid and in the lead up to the democratic dispensation, women felt there was one enemy, right, for us, which was the apartheid state. And so having a clear and identified enemy creates an environment where it's easier to mobilize collectively. However, I believe that I think after the various gains, particularly legislatively, as well as in relation to the political representation of women, South Africa is one of the leading countries in the world when it comes to gender representation of women in government. However, Rwanda now leads us, is ahead of us. However, that has created an environment where a sense of urgency is not as intense as it was back in the day. And unfortunately, after the national shutdown by women in 2018, we haven't seen the same spirit coming from the ground, particularly when it comes to feminist organizing and women's organizing in this country.
How do intersecting identities, and that being race, class, rural-urban divide, just influence the experiences of women in our country, particularly with regards to their rights and opportunities?
Thank you so much for that question, and it's very important. So just to let the viewers in on what intersectionality is, and intersectionality as a theoretical framework. So intersectionality was coined by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, based in the United States in the late 80s, to say that Black women in particular experience oppression from a multi-axis vantage point. So you don't only experience discrimination or oppression just because of your gender, unlike white women, or because of your race, unlike Black women, Black men, but because of your identity as a Black woman, you experience multiple forms of injustices at the same time. So because of your race, because of your gender. And it gets worse if you are a Black woman living with disabilities, a Black woman who is living in an economically precarious position, such as Black women domestic workers, Black women farm workers. And it's also, we need to stress and highlight the fact that Black women in this country are employed in their majority in the informal sector, so as domestic workers, as farm workers, and other various kinds of work. And that then leads them into a context of economic marginality. So oftentimes Black women are underpaid and overworked. And so it's important then to have that kind of analysis when looking at the structural effects of whether it's poverty, inequality, gendered oppression. So we need to always have that holistic analysis, because we cannot, create policies that are progressive when we don't understand the multiple ways in which they affect Black women as a whole. So, for instance, if you don't have this intersectional analysis, you will create kind of budgets and programming that don't speak to Black rural women, that don't speak to Black women domestic workers. So we need to have that holistic understanding and interpretation of structural injustice.
Dr. Dlakavu, I just want us to pause for a minute. The National Women's Day celebrations are currently taking place in Limpopo, and the Minister of Women, Children and People Living with Disabilities is currently giving an address. I'd like us just to listen in on some of the points that she's going to be touching on, and maybe we can pick up on that. Let's take you now back to Limpopo, where the Minister is giving that address.
What has been done and what still needs to be done. Allow me to also acknowledge the many Women's Month activities planned across departments and various spheres of government, as well as society at large. Just yesterday, the Justice, Crime Prevention and Security Cluster, led by Minister Kubai, undertook a gender-based violence and femicide awareness and prevention activation in Bizo, in Mopani district. These activities must not just be symbolic, they must drive real change. As I close, Honorable Premier Ramatuba, you and I can agree that opening market access for women is definitely not a rocket science. It is just a will. As we host the G20 and lead various groups, we must ensure that women are not watching from the sideline. They must be at the center. I'm calling on every minister, every department, every sector leader present in this room, that when you procure for your G20 conferences, your decors, your catering, your translation services, the branded goods, the corporate gifts, look no further. Look at the women of South Africa. They are doing it. This is produced by women of South Africa. This is produced and made by women of South Africa. They will just cost you 300 rand each. And we are saying this is beautiful enough to be gifts that you can give to your guests. Buy from our women. And therefore, we are saying, Program Director, the Women's Month is active, it is visible, and it is full of purpose. Just this past week, we welcome the new National Youth Development Agency Board appointed by the President. Once again, it is led by a young woman, doctor, that is a PhD doctor, Minenhle Sunshine Myende. Ayaroka mayanga yanga ayaroka. Mr. President, allow me to call on stage for South Africa to meet the new board of the National Youth Development Agency, but also to shake your hand, Mr. President, because it is you yourself who appointed them. And I will request that Deputy Minister Steve Litsike joins the President in shaking the hands of our new board of the NYDA. I thank you very much. Ayaroka mayanga yanga ayaroka.
So that is the Minister of Women, Children and People Living with Disabilities, giving an address there at the National Women's Day celebrations, introducing the newly elected board chair of the NYDA, a young woman who's also just given so much in terms of her own work that she has done. We now continue with our conversation with the executive director at Dlakavu Impact Strategies and researcher at the Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg's Dr. Simamkele Dlakavu. Doc, I mean, we listened there to the minister, and she was speaking primarily on market access for women, touched on the G20, saying that women shouldn't be sitting on the sidelines. What would you say are just some of those key barriers for women's full participation and inclusion in economic activities?
I was listening also to the minister. For me, the whole ministry is quite a disappointing entity in itself, because it's saddening that we get to hear mostly from the minister and it's a ministry during events commemorating Women's Month. But outside of that, we don't hear any substantive inputs in relation to gender justice in this country from the minister. So if you look, for instance, at the budget of the Women's Ministry budget, if you look at the kinds of events and campaigns that they host, you see that their budget is dominated by conferences, by once-off campaigns and commemorations when women are dying in this country in numbers. A statistic by the South African Medical Research Council noted that every 10 minutes, a woman is killed intentionally by her partner or family in South Africa. Yet a women's ministry dominates an event like this by speaking to minuscule deliverables, such as access to the market, without addressing any structural impediments to women's access to the market. The fact that 3 white men still own the same wealth as the same as the half of the economic injustice issue, and it's quite disappointing that a ministry that's aimed to empowering women in this country is only a ministry of events. And so I just hope that the entire ministry reconsidered its own approach to gender justice. Just beyond this critique is that I want to offer a kind of warning. So in the lead up to the 1994 elections, as well as when finally we received a progressive constitution that allowed us to have a Chapter 9 institution such as the Commission for Gender Equity, South Africa used to have a gender-responsive government, budget, and government. In the early democratic era, particularly in the Mandela presidency, as well as the Mbeki presidency, the women's ministry wasn't just coordinated into one budget that is underfunded, but gender justice was mainstreamed in our government. However, we saw that once former President Jacob Zuma was elected into a power, a man who's not known for his gender progressiveness, those institutions and those policies that were meant to mainstream gender were eroded and effectively were set back. And so for me, for this presidency, and I wrote with my co-supervisor at the time, Professor Amanda Gous, in 2021 and 2022, we wrote about how these key instruments and institutions for gender justice in South Africa were hollowed out. And we called on President Ramaphosa to actually look at the ways in which these institutions were basically demobilized and underfunded. Because when we think about state capture in our country, we only think about these major institutions such as Eskom, what happened to Eskom, what happened to Transnet. Right. But what had happened also to institutions that were meant for gender equality. And for me, it was quite disappointing listening to the minister.
All right, Dr. Dlakavu, we're going to end things there, and hopefully with the President's address that's about to take place right now at that commemoration celebration, he will touch on some of the issues that you say you've addressed with the Presidency. Thank you so much for your contributions and your time, and have yourself a wonderful Women's Day. So that was Executive Director at Dlakavu Impact Strategies and researcher at the Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg, Dr. Simamkele Dlakavu.